Good evening and welcome to the Friday New York Symposium. I'm Diane Sayre, LaRouche independent candidate for U.S. Senate in New York. And I wanted to focus actually on an anniversary, which was yesterday, April 25th, the 79th anniversary of the famous meeting of the American and Russian troops at the Elbe River in Germany when it was clear that they had finally broken the German line, that the end of the fascist regime of Adolf Hitler in Europe was near. And in fact, VE Day was only, I guess, about a week and a half, 2 weeks after this joyous occasion. Before I get to that, I want to discuss a little bit about why I consider this so important. And that is the world is really on a precipice right now. It is largely or almost entirely due to the arrogance and delusional qualities of the leaders of these so-called civilized Western nations, or what they like to think of themselves. Ukraine is losing the war. Even the most ardent pro-Ukraine writers in the British press are saying that at most Ukraine will last another 6 months. That is may not get through to the November elections or just barely. That's got to be of great concern for Joe Biden, who is taking everything on weakening Russia. And you have people like Macron in France talking about sending ground troops, just pushing and pushing. We have Tony Blinken, our Secretary of State, in China to have some meetings. Perhaps he'll get a dose of reality. The idea that somehow the United States is going to stop Russia and China from working together is another extreme delusion. It's not happening. And you have to ask yourself, why would anyone in their right mind want to work with the United States when we have declared ourselves and others working with us or that we are funding, like Israel or Ukraine, to be above international law? That the fact that Israel has been found to plausibly be committing genocide in Gaza by the International Court of Justice and the UN Security Council calls for a ceasefire, which we do not veto, but we nonetheless say it is non-binding. Or when you have the case just recently of the newly discovered mass grave at a hospital in Gaza, and the United States says, well, the Israelis will do the investigation. Really? This is beyond belief. The world is looking in amazement at the insanity of the West and the foolishness and danger that brings with it, because if you presume that you will get to do whatever you want and no one's going to respond, you're likely to end up in a terrible miscalculation. Now, in the United States itself, there are, as of now, probably more than 35 college campuses which have been occupied by students who find it completely unbearable that their government, namely the United States, would be complicit in funding and supporting genocide against the people of Gaza. And the incendiary news media, particularly rags like the New York Post or these right-wing Christian Zionist congressmen, are just telling outright lies. It is not anti-Semitic to be against genocide. The students at Columbia, which I visited myself, are not screaming death to Israel. That is just not happening. They're not screaming death to America, death to Jews. In fact, a large portion of the students at the Columbia occupation and at all of these are Jewish students who are having their Passover Seder out on the lawn because they also have families who died in the Holocaust, and they're seeing that what the Netanyahu British-run, British NATO-run regime in Israel is doing to the Palestinian people is identical to what Adolf Hitler did to the Jewish people, and they don't want any part of it. And that's the reality of the situation. Why? Why is all this occurring? Why is the United States so insane? Why is it that the only thing both parties can come together on is sending $100 billion worth of weapons to Ukraine, Israel, Taiwan, and voting up warrantless surveillance on the American people and banning TikTok if its owners don't sell it within the next 9 months? What's going on? And the issue is, as Lyndon LaRouche warned, we are at the end of the possibility of existence of the British liberal transatlantic system. It's over. It can't be sustained. It is a gigantic $2 quadrillion bubble in need of loot, and it's running out of loot, and hence their drive to suck everything into it, and the danger, but also the potential for a new system. Now, 80 years ago, the United States, Russia, and China, and the UK, I would say a little bit differently, but were allied in defeating fascism in Europe and Asia. And there was a great camaraderie. There is strong historical reason for the United States and Russia to be allies, as well as the United States and China. And I wanted my friend and colleague and longtime LaRouche associate writer, Bill Jones, to join me and just tell you something about the events at the Elbe River. So I'm going to stop there, and Bill, please go ahead.
Thank you, Diane. Thank you for having me this evening. The very important anniversary, which people just don't know, this is just make clear, this is not the Elbe that people know from Napoleon leaving the island. This is ELBE, is a river in central, actually traversing central Germany, which was the meeting point between the Western forces that were coming from the West and the Soviet army, which was moving from the East. And of course, at the point that they met up, it was clear that Germany would then be divided, that they had actually, destroyed the capability, the unity of the German nation. The war was not over, as Diane indicated. It would go in a couple of more weeks. Berlin was surrounded. Russia had the job, had the task of taking Berlin, and there was a lot of street-to-street fighting that would still be going on. But by May 9th, it was all over. But at this meeting, of course, this was the first meeting between two allies that had been working for years, thanks to the relationship that Franklin Roosevelt had established very consciously with Joseph Stalin, the Soviet leader. And his view was that not only was it necessary for this alliance in order to defeat Nazi Germany, it was also the possibility for creating a relationship with a country that is the Soviet Union, with which the United States had broken relations with shortly after the Bolshevik Revolution, a country in which the United States could again begin working with in the post-war period in order to establish peace and harmony in the world. And this was with the Roosevelt view. But the soldiers themselves, including the generals, had very little understanding of what their counterparts were all about. So that this meeting on the Elbe was also, in many respects, the first encounter between these two very different cultures in one sense. And therefore, it was very significant. And it was a very happy occasion for all of those, because they knew that at the point that this occurred, then it meant that the war was soon going to be over. The Americans reached the Elbe River before the Soviets did. There was still a little bit of fighting that they had to do to get to that point, but within a few days they were there, and the Americans crossed the river to meet their Soviet counterparts. And I want to show you a couple of videos from that occasion, which we have available here.
Расцветали яблони и груши, поплыли туманы над рекой. Выходила на берег Катюша, на высокий берег, на крутой. Выходила на берег Катюша, на высокий берег, на крутой.
Here where the generals meet. And then second one's just a little longer. I think it has a text, which is also useful. Sure. I guess General Reinhardt, who was the head of the forces. I'm not sure who met the Soviet counterparts. Here you see the more formal ceremonies now. Soldier explaining the medal he won. And the Soviet and American officers then. And of course, they wanted to make this a big moment because they wanted to send a signal back home as well that this would soon be over. Here you go. Little dancing. This guy's good. Yeah. And you can see on the faces, like you look at the face of the general, they're still trying to figure out, what their counterparts are like and what they think. And it was a learning process. There was this, I think the woman there is a Soviet. We didn't have a lot of women who were in the combat zone like that. And the American soldier. And this is obviously the photo op. I don't think they're going to be going across the bridge, but they will stop and show you that they're there together.
On the 25th of April 1945,
it's just an indication, a little bit of
Soviet
a map of
and
where they
American
were,
troops
where they met
at the
at
Elbe
Torgau.
River
They're
near
on the river.
Torgau in Germany.
And then, of course, a lot of the Soviet forces had to move into Berlin. This was actually just the ironies of history, that this was the Ukrainian First Army that was met at Torgau. They were actually part of the Soviet forces. Probably generally Russian-speaking Ukrainian divisions.
On the East Bank, they met forward elements
Yeah.
of the Ukrainian front. The same day, another patrol under Second Lieutenant William Robertson.
And here you got Robertson and Savashko, and then the famous is the meeting. These are the two patrol leaders that were the first ones who got there.
Of
the
the
General Reinhardt, who
69th
commanded the
Infantry
troops.
Division of the First Army, Emil F. Reinhardt, and the commander of the 85th Guards Rifle Division of the 5th Guards
And the
Army,
officers,
Vladimir Rushakov, met at
and then
Torgau,
I think the iconic.
southwest of Berlin. Arrangements
Mhm.
were made for the formal handshake of Torgau between Robertson
Okay,
and
there's Savashko and
the two
and Robinson.
leaders, in front
That became
of
an
the
iconic
photographers
picture
the
of the
following
Elbe
day,
meeting.
27th of April. During the Cold War, the meeting of the two armies was often recalled as a symbol of
Zdrovia.
peace and friendship between the people of the
Your
two
health.
superpowers. After
I guess
the Cold
they might
War
have
in
brought the vodka with them.
1995,
This was
the
a
Russian
seal that was
Federation issued a
established later on. I
three-letter
can't remember the date of it
commemorating
now, but in the
the
last 20
50th
years,
anniversary of
memorializing the meeting at the Elbe
River.
that was
The monument
printed
at
by
Torgau
the
still
Russian authorities.
commemorates the
This
first
is the monument in
encounters between
Torgau
the US
to the
and the Soviet
Elbe,
troops in
monument to
April
the
of
Elbe meeting.
1945.
Okay. Now this was a very important occurrence, and it continued because at the point that the war was over, then of course there was all the arrangements that had to be made for the distribution of forces in occupied Germany. And of course, there were a lot of agreements that were made. Not everybody was happy with them. The British were generally unhappy with every what they would consider concession to the Soviets. That, for instance, it was agreed that they would take Berlin. Now, the idea of this is not simply to appease them, but look, let's look at the realities here. The United States lost about 500,000 soldiers, I think 400 something thousand. The Soviet Union losses were 30 million out of, I guess, a population of 160 million at the time. 30 million of the young men of the working, force in the Soviet Union. It was obvious to everybody that the brunt of this war against fascism had been borne by the Soviet Union. There was of course, most of the cities of Russia had been completely devastated by the Russian invasion. Most of the battles going on and the loss of life were either on Soviet territory or in the territories which were then part of the Soviet Union or in the Eastern European countries. And so it was generally understood that this ally, which had suffered the greatest losses, should have the opportunity for going to the victory and raising the flag on the Reichstag, which they did. Everybody wasn't happy, especially Winston Churchill, who really wanted to have a division of Europe between the Soviet Union and Great Britain, and tried to actually go behind Franklin Roosevelt's back to talk to Stalin to try and divvy up what's going to be, your sphere of influence, what's going to be ours. But as soon as Roosevelt found out about that was all off at that point. But the idea that he had was that they would be a part of this post-war world order, which would be created in the aftermath of the war in order to prevent wars from again happening. This was also followed up by many of the other people, especially in the military. Let me just mention that every year, we'll get to what happened yesterday in Arlington Cemetery. Every year, there is a ceremony. There has been a ceremony since 1995. At the 50th anniversary of World War II, it was decided that there would be a plaque commemorating the Elbe meeting in Arlington Cemetery. And ever since then, every year, I think, the Russian embassy had been able to go up and to lay a wreath. And this was a ceremony. It wasn't just the Russian embassy. Arlington is run by the United States Army. And of course, the United States Army also honors those who perished during World War II. So you had at these ceremonies, and you can go online, I don't have the video of it, but there you can go online, take a look at them. You have the Russians, you have people, many from the Russian diaspora, many of the World War II veterans, now they're gone, but they've been going to these things every year. And you have the Arlington bugler who will play taps at that memorial. 2022, this was stopped because of the Ukraine war, and they made the decision that the Russian embassy would not have the ability to do this ceremony. It was not the army that made the decision. It was the State Department which sent down word that this ceremony would be canceled. And if you look at one of the earlier ceremonies, you will see in the background none other than Victoria Nuland, who was forced to go to these ceremonies, probably eating crow at every minute that she was there, who probably made that decision, was in a very high position in the State Department at the time, 2022. So what this year, as this started to roll around, I contacted a friend, Ed Lazansky, who is he is ironically a Soviet dissident who is a Russian patriot. And he came to the United States as a Soviet dissident. He was close to a lot of people in Congress. He was close to President Reagan, but he was also a Russian patriot. And he did a lot here on Capitol Hill every year to have meetings between Russian and U.S. scholars to talk about the situation of U.S.-Russian relations. Now he's mainly operating in Russia because the environment here has become so bad for that kind of activity. So I called him and said, look, we should have something. We should have a Zoom meeting or something on April 25th so that it isn't forgotten. And he said, I'm already working on it and we have something there. And he asked for people who could, make tapes. Diane, I believe, made one for him as well, for just people from all over the world who could comment on the importance of this, not only of this memorial, but also of the U.S.-Russia relationship. And I said to him, look, I can go up and lay flowers at that memorial if nobody else is going to do it. He says, well, get some veterans and to go up there and do the memorial, and we'll get you on WhatsApp so that our memorial here can see and what's going on in the United States. So we did that, and I had two other Army vets, including Bill Salisbury, who has been a LaRouche activist from way back when, and very close to Linda LaRouche because he was on his security detail, and he was a Vietnam veteran, and he was wounded in battle, and he was excited about this possibility. You see a picture of him, the three of us there at the memorial. And we went up and we did that, and it was on WeChat. We were, taping it on the video, WeChat video, and whatever arrangements they had there in Moscow, they were able to see this. And Lazansky had said to me afterwards that people were very emotional about the fact that it had occurred. So this was extremely important. I just like to mention a number of things on how that actually created a situation in which that relationship could have ended up much differently than it actually did. One of the people who was intent on securing this relationship with the Russians was General Dwight Eisenhower. And he had, at an early stage after the May 9th surrender, close relations with General Zhukov, who was the commander of the Soviet forces. I don't think either of them spoke a common language, but they really had a very close relationship. And Zhukov always said he was very impressed with Eisenhower's strategy during the war, especially how he utilized combined operations, Navy, Air Force, military, in the invasion of Europe. And of course, Eisenhower knew that Zhukov, who had been placed in troublesome spots during the Soviet period ever since the 1930s, was probably the most experienced general that he knew. And they became actually very close. And he felt that if he could use this relationship to cement a stronger relationship with the Soviet leaders, that this would help to create a new permanent relationship with the Soviet Union. He actually made the comment that our relationships with the British at the beginning of the war were very bad. He says, and it got better. He says, maybe we could do that with the Soviet Union as well. And he attempted to do that, and he was really highly regarded. He went to Moscow in 46, and he was offered to be on the podium at the major parade with all these Soviet leaders. Remember all this? They're all sitting up on the podium. Khrushchev is there, or Stalin is there, and all this. And Eisenhower was the first foreign leader that was asked to stand beside Stalin as this was going on. I mean, we don't see pictures of this. I don't know where they are. They should be here. But and he was also intent and tried to improve Zhukov's position within the Soviet bureaucracy so that he could use that to try and create a better relationship. And of course, it wasn't so easy, because when they were managing the situation in Germany, it was always the case that Eisenhower had the full powers to make the decision, but Zhukov always had to confer with Moscow before he could do that. So there were a lot of difficulties there. And Eisenhower was attempting to change that. But a lot of things served to undercut this relationship, including the dropping of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima. And Edgar Snow, who one of my favorite authors, was in Moscow at the time that Eisenhower was there, and was at the Kremlin, and he describes some of this stuff, which I think is very significant. He said, let's see if I can find that they had come back. Yeah, okay. He said Ike was the first foreigner Stalin ever invited to stand beside him on the marble podium over Lenin in Red Square. Just below them, I also stood for 5 hours that day watching the victory parade. Returning with Zhukov from a visit to a collective farm, Ike invited 17 generals to the American embassy for an informal snack. By the time they left early in the morning, they were all making harmony with "I've been working on the railroad," led by an NKVD officer. But none of this deceived anyone about the big atomic mushroom now hanging over the future. As Ike admitted in one afternoon in Moscow, apparently to Snow, before the atom bomb was used, he answered a private question privately, I would have said yes. I was sure we could keep the peace with Russia. Now I don't know. I had hoped the bomb wouldn't figure in this war. Until now, I would have said that we three, Britain with her mighty fleet, America with the strongest air force, and Russia with the strongest land force on the continent, we three could have guaranteed the peace of the world for a long, long time to come. But now I don't know. People are frightened and disturbed all over. Everyone feels insecure again. And of course, the subsequent policies also of Truman, the creation of the Truman Doctrine, the more aggressive policy towards Russia, including a kind of personal insults in some respects against Molotov, who was the foreign minister, soured the relationship to the point where it was really couldn't be restored. And then we had the Cold War and everything that went after that. So that unfortunately, what we have had since then is such a degeneration of our own diplomatic policy that we no longer have the spirit that imbued an Eisenhower or an FDR in creating these relations. There have been attempts to do that. With the demise of the Soviet Union, as people may know, Lyndon LaRouche, who had been in jail for 5 years, was released on parole and really worked as a track two connection to Russia under Yeltsin. And he went there and was really highly regarded because of everybody knew the role that he had in the Reagan SDI program, which was a program for creating stability and peace, sharing of technologies, as President Reagan himself agreed with the LaRouche proposal in that respect, that it could have created a different situation. But the problem was that this track two operation was overrun by the Track 1 operation, which involved Al Gore and Victor Chernomyrdin, and they had completely different policies. And Russia suffered greatly under this 10 years of capitalism in which the robber barons entered in and took all the valuable resources that Russia had, similar to what they're doing now in Ukraine, of going in, buying everything up, and controlling everything. With the appointment of Putin by Yeltsin to take over the government, all of this changed, and then we have all seen, tremendous changes from that period. I mean, I remember 1994 when I was in Moscow, people were in the subways and they were selling their cats and their dogs and their jewelry and everything just in order to get money. I mean, it was terrible. Putin changed that altogether, and at least in the beginning, he was highly respected for that fact. But because we've had this notion that somehow we have to have this unilateral world order where we call the shots, they were not going to allow Russia to be recognized as anything but a subordinate power. We have something I wanted to mention on this is that President Putin, who has been, denigrated and talked against the whole time, described as a new Hitler or whatever, one of the most astute politicians that we have in the world, much more astute than we have here in the United States, I must say. He made a speech in 2007, long before any, any overt operations in Ukraine, indicating what the problem was, that the world had developed to such a degree that we have to begin thinking in terms of a different model of governance. And I just want to quote some of the things from that speech, which I think is very important. This was at the Munich Defense Conference that's held every year. Nowadays, you get a lot of warlike speeches, but he was invited to come and talk about the situation of Russia. This is what he said. He said, this universal indivisible character of security, the issue for the Munich conference, is expressed as the basic principle that security for one is security for all. As Franklin D. Roosevelt said during the first few days that the Second World War is breaking out, when peace is broken anywhere, the peace of all countries everywhere is in danger. These words remain topical today. Incidentally, the theme of our conference, Global Crises, Global Responsibility, exemplifies this. Only 2 decades ago, the world was ideologically and economically divided and was the huge strategic potential of 2 superpowers that ensured global security. This global standoff pushed the sharpest economic and social problems to the margins of the international communities and the world's agenda. And just like any war, the Cold War left us with live ammunition, figuratively speaking. I'm referring to ideological stereotypes, double standards, and other typical aspects of Cold War thinking. The unipolar world that has been proposed after the Cold War did not take place either. The history of humanity certainly has gone through unipolar periods and seen aspirations to world supremacy, and what hasn't happened in world history. However, what is a unipolar world? However one might embellish this term, at the end of the day, it refers to one type of situation, namely one center of authority, one center of force, one center of decision-making. It is a world in which there is one master, one sovereign. And at the end of the day, this is pernicious, not only for those within this system, but also for the sovereign itself, because it destroys itself from within. And especially these last words, I think, is extremely significant. We see the chaos in our nation at this point. I would just like to end, there's one other thing I'd like to show you, and that was in Moscow, they had this, the counterpart to our little demonstration in Arlington was held at a monument for the Elbe, which is in the center of Moscow, but it's also encased by a memorial to the collaboration between Alexander II and Abraham Lincoln. People may not remember that, but we might not have won the Civil War, had not the Russians sent their fleets to San Francisco, New York, because the British were prepared to enter into it. They were already cooperating with the Confederacy, and had they done that, that might have tipped everything over in a different direction. But because the Russians were here, it was a signal to the British that they would have to fight them as well. And so that really secured. This is what Bill Salisbury also made that point very succinctly at the event to the Moscow group. But I'll show you the Moscow people here. They're releasing the doves of peace.
Три.
There you see Alexander and Lincoln there.
Спасибо всем, друзья. Счастья, мира и любви.
Sure. So thanks for listening here.
Well, thank you very much. And that's so heartening because that was yesterday, and that's Russians who want peace and American patriots who want peace and don't think that we should be adversaries. While we're here, I just wanted to ask Dave to pull up a photograph because so many Americans have forebears who fought in World War II. And here is John McLaughlin, who was in the Fighting 69s, the uncle of Adam Mosio, who has been an excellent volunteer in the Rockland County area where I am. And there are so many Americans who have family members who fought in World War II against Hitler. And I think part of the timing of this, well, they probably hoped that all the World War II veterans would be dead, so we could get away with this outrageous reversal where we are literally supporting pro-Nazi fascists in Ukraine. And of course, supporting is a peculiar word to use because tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of them are dead. And now they're talking about kidnapping men who have fled into other countries and bringing them back into Ukraine to fight because they have no manpower. But we are working with supporting, running, advising, intermingled with a fascist regime fighting Russia in a war which absolutely was provoked by NATO. Now, meanwhile, as you said, Bill, we are collapsing. We are absolutely collapsing. I don't have to tell Americans about the state of our infrastructure or the potholes. I'm going to call my 2024 Senate race the campaign of the potholes. I think I and my volunteers have lost about a half dozen tires so far at great expense, thanks to the wonderful conditions of the roads in New York. Now, meanwhile, Russia has a totally other approach, and I just want to show this, and you may want to say something about this very exciting Baikal-Amur mainline railroad, which I think it's this green part here, which has just been completed. The red is the Trans-Siberian Railroad, which really was inspired in part by, or I guess, yeah, the American Transcontinental Railroad, and an American, George Washington Whistler, went over there to work on this and died in Russia. But Bill, do you want to say anything about this incredible?
Yeah, look, the Trans-Siberian, I mean, there were people here when we built the Transcontinental Railroad. We had, very close, of course, post-Civil War, we had very close relations with Russia. And that the people, including one of the Russian princes, Prince Kilkov, who later was appointed by Sergei Witte, the chief of the railroad in the building of the Trans-Siberian, came over here to look at the construction and to look at how you're dealing with bridges, with tunnels and everything, taking those lessons back so that they can build the Trans-Siberian, which of course is much longer than the Transcontinental. But those were the lessons that were learned. The BAM was another line. It was also built as kind of a second line. It was a little bit further north than the Trans-Siberian, and it means that they have these two means of getting out to the Far East, which is very long. Like this is what is it, 11 time zones in Russia, so it's big distances, and you got to have quick travel if you're going to be able to do anything really effectively over those long distances. So the railroads were important. The BAM was built a little further up because if you look at the Trans-Siberian, it goes very close to China. And, by the 1960s, then they were getting a little nervous about, the conflict they were having with China. Said, look, we got to get a little further. But it gave them the ability. This isn't the end of the game either. I mean, they're rebuilding the BAM because with the isolation that's being forced upon the Russians from the Western countries, I mean, just being cut off more or less, they are moving to the East. And that's, of course, where the action is. That is the biggest market in the world. It's not only China, but the other countries there. And they want to have a very good presence there. So that Putin is intent on building this railroad. In addition, this area, this tremendous area, contains every element in the periodic table. And they're going to utilize those elements as a means for the development of the other countries. This is also a lifeline in that respect. So there will be initially there is the improvement of the BAM, and then they're going to build several more. There's another 1,000 kilometers that they already have planned to connect from European Russia to the BAM. And there are also going to be these north-south connections. There's one in the east, in the European part, which would take the rail connections all the way down to Iran and to the Indian Ocean. But there will be more planned as they move on in order to have a north-south grid, which at this point is, at least in the eastern part, is lacking. So there are a lot of big plans that they have. They have the capability to do it. They're relying on their own resources, and they will do this. So the idea of trying to isolate Russia somehow in their 11 time zones, this is pure foolishness.
Exactly. I was saying the other day that if the United States were to modernize a transcontinental railroad here or build the 43,000 miles of high-speed rail that Rich Freeman estimates that we need, that would have enormous power in unifying the country. People, when you have a mission, when you have a positive mission, what you're looking at is the talent of your fellow Americans. What can they bring to bear? Who cares about their religion, their socioeconomic status, their ethnicity, or whatever? You're not interested. You say, who is an engineer? Who is a builder? Who can help us do this? And you suddenly find yourself pulled together. So I think the combination of the Russian people realizing that Putin's actions were correct when they saw how duplicitous the Western leaders were with regard to Ukraine. So the Russian people, as we saw in the recent elections, are very unified behind Putin. It is one factor, but also I think 2 million people were involved in building this thing. So what does that do for a nation? How does that create a sense of unity, pride, dignity, and cooperation? And Russia also has many, many different ethnic groups besides the time zones, many different religions and ethnicities.
And they've been very successful in keeping them together, a little more successful than we have. I'll just mention one additional thing is that the Palestinian people, one of the most educated populations in the region, in spite of the poverty and everything else, there's been so much of a emphasis on educating that this is a tremendous resource that is being totally destroyed, eliminated by the actions of the Israeli government. And this is a blow to humanity, not only because of the evil designs, but also because of the tremendous loss that has become to mankind because of their capabilities.
Thank you for pointing that out. And as our viewers know, I have endorsed the OASIS plan of Lyndon and Helga Zepp-LaRouche, which is a two-state solution based on greening the deserts, again, the common mission. And I also would like to say, because it really hasn't been covered in the US press, that Hamas has made it known that they would stop fighting, release all the hostages if a two-state solution were to be put on the table and a ceasefire. So for all the people who say, oh, they're never going to recognize Israel, no, they are offering a pathway to peace. You're not allowed to know about it because there seems to be an interest in continuing this war, an interest in numbing people to the horrors that are being carried out against the population of Gaza by the Israeli forces as backed by the Americans, British, and others. But there has to be a higher level way to solve this. And again, it really depends on collaboration for a common mission. And the shared enemy of everybody in the region is the desert, which gives them a way to work together. So, Bill, I'd really like to thank you for having been here. We probably should wrap up since there's another meeting coming up, but do you have any final words or thoughts?
Well, I just encourage everybody to do whatever they can when these anniversaries come up. This is an important element of mobilizing people to try and counter this crazy narrative, this cultural elimination of Russia, which we see reflected here, maybe not as intensively as Ukraine, but in a very big way. And that we got to do everything to change that. It's a very important culture. It's been important for the history of our own country, all the way back to the American Revolution, when we also had support from Russia during that period. And that cannot be forgotten. That cannot be erased from our own history. So anything people can do, especially in terms of the memorials, in terms of celebration of Russian culture, anything you can do to keep the fires burning in terms of this element in order to counter what is a very devastating and very nasty operation to try and eliminate an entire people.
Thank you very much. And I would say there are two federal candidates who support the kind of relations that we should have between the US and Russia, and that is myself and Jose Vega and CD 15. And we are in the throes of an extremely intense drive to collect between us about 90,000 petition signatures. So if you would like to help, you're welcome to come to New York. Also, we need funds urgently. You can visit sareforsenate.com to volunteer, to donate. I'd love to see all of you. And you can all come, especially if you're willing to sleep on the floor. I'll put you up myself. But please join the campaign and don't despair. It looks horribly bleak in the United States, but that's only because we're in the minority dark age part of the planet. And if we would change, the world would be a much better place. So thanks very much, Bill, and I hope to see you soon.
Thank you, Diane.